What's up, everybody, and welcome to the last episode of Why Am I Like This in March of 2024. Um, Happy eclipse season. Hope it's been okay, at least okay for y'all. I know it's been rocking a lot of people from place to place as I kind of go around the internet reading about things. And I would say, my physical reality has been full of odd synchronicities, but I haven't seen too much crazy shit happening. What is saying that month was a long week. um, but yeah, if you're tuning in for the first time, Why Am I Like This is a container which is part of the Broom Radio, where I mostly hold space for long form responses to questions that I get either in the Broom or further afield. Um, and the question that I felt called to bring up today actually just came in yesterday. And that question is from a member of the Broom and the tender and the gardener of the Broom named Lexi. And the question is, what is the importance of predictions, making predictions and verifying them, in my opinion or experience? And I wasn't sure if I would be ready to transmit on this question, but my vaster self was pretty insistent on it. So here we are. I just want to hold space for anybody who's here live to chime in on what comes up in reading this question or hearing this question being read, if anything. Lexi had said it feels related to Sophia and how a vast aspect of her is a planner. And I was curious if you wanted to say more about planning and how it relates to prediction for you. While I'm waiting for responses, I'll say what I often say in this container, which is that I guarantee that contexts will be disenmeshed and contexts will not be enmeshed, and that I'll hold space for good faith offerings of refinement, whether they pertain to the guarantee or the container in general. I feel like there are bajillions of things that I want to say about this topic, but I'm really interested in how it's going to go specifically. Recently, I've been channeling threads on social media which sort of relate to the trinity of art and science, and I would say medicine, more so than healing. And then I've been having conversations about this on and off for a really long time, but I think the intensity and the frequency of those conversations in the past 2 weeks has sort of arced up a little bit, and I've also felt called to interact more with science as a lineage, and then people who could legitimately call themselves scientists, and the artifacts of the work of science, such as white papers. Um, Hoda says, it feels important to me in the sense that it creates an outlet to have a ledger of interpersonally verified gnosis, even if the self that you're confirming with is yourself across time. I love that because I feel like the use of the word ledger sort of relates to something which feels more like it's related to betting. And then when you talk about interpersonal verification, it feels like something relates more to, I'd say, like, I want to say like the industry of science. I'm just going to continue holding space while also opening up my channel. I'm going to leave a container in the middle of this episode's container. It feels like a gigantic slab of amber for me. And then I'm going to sprinkle goldstone around, different colors. And kind of tune in if that feels aligned for you to the pre-verbal or non-lexical offerings. Ooh, Ho drops the phrase, the economics of knowing. Woo! Oh, that's really big. Regarding Sophia and being a planner, Lexi says, I feel like it's still forming for me, but I think of planning in terms of where the collective is heading, like 10, 20, 50, 100, and 1,500 years from now. Yeah, something about just like putting those numbers out, which I guess, like, yeah, snaps things into context for me on the relationship between predictions and planning. Thank you. Hmm. So I guess, like, within the container of this episode, along with all the other offerings I mentioned before, I'm going to place 3 containers. And one of them, I'll say, relates to shapes or terma regarding the difference between predictions and manifestation. Um, and then you can imagine that at the base of a triangle, if you like. And then to the right and above, so in the one of the other corners of the triangle, I'm going to place a container relating to extrapolation and science. And then in the other corner, the remaining corner of the triangle, I'll place a container which relates to, I'm just going to call it quackery. But you could also call it like spiritual hazard. Um, and again, I invite everybody who's here live to kind of tune into those containers if it feels aligned to them. And I'll also hold space for y'all to say what's coming up, and you can jump on audio if it feels more natural. Something about like this episode feels kind of like witchy to me. And I guess what's coming up in that context is something we've talked about in the Broom Radio before, is the topic of folk science. And I think sometimes the term is called like indigenous science. Sometimes people just call it like folk magic. Um, I think some people might call it myth making, which I think for me in the past has tended to feel a little derogatory, as if it kind of places magic and ritual and narrative making somewhere below, quote, objective fact or objective knowledge, unquote. Um, but I feel like that'll make sense for y'all. But I feel also like what I'm kind of like spinning around, like stirring in the cauldron of this container in some way is, I'd say like the nexus of what some people might call like placebo or belief. It's like a really gigantic topic, and there are entire fields of study dedicated to the philosophy of science. So I'm also naming and owning, I'll say, the trepidation in my present life vessel on approaching this topic, because I know a lot of people with expensive educations or lengthy educations who have probably written a lot of books and have names, um, which sound very reputable, have dropped knowledge on this topic before. And I'll say that I have not spent a lot of time reading said books or studying said topics in institutions where the ability of the person to, I'll say, regurgitate what they've studied is verified using tests, and then the results of those tests are certified. Anna questions superstition. I'd love to look up the etymology of that, but I won't do it now. But yeah, sort of like observing how that lands in my field too. Oh, I had said oof, and I was like, yeah, there is something like, I feel like something pretty big being cleared with regard to these topics. Um, and I want to say kind of like, like in cartoons sometimes, like a creature or a bunch of creatures gets like flattened by a car, and then the car leaves, and then like the cartoon has to kind of reinflate itself. I mean, I feel like in some ways, like that's kind of what I'm observing when it comes to a bunch of different cultures, which I think had like very different, what is sometimes called cosmovisions, um, which have been sort of flattened by, I'll say, like the reach. I would say, like almost like the imperialistic reach of what we call science nowadays. Um, hmm. Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the question again because we've sort of like done a bunch of container setting. The question is, what is the importance of predictions, making predictions, and verifying them in your opinion/experience? And then I laid out 3 containers regarding A, spiritual hazard, B, well, I guess I'll talk about spiritual hazard first. Um, so, I mean, if you've been listening or like following the work of people who garden and tend the container, which we call the broom or the broom radio, then I feel like you probably know that safety and community are pretty big topics for us. And you'll probably know that the broom, I'd say, like came about really in the pandemic era when I think a lot of people found their way back to the internet and to Twitter in specific, um, because physical social life had closed down quite a bit. And then I would say that due to a number of factors, more people were getting into spirituality. I don't think it was just like the changes in physical circumstances, which caused that to happen. I would say that the changes in physical circumstances had metaphysical roots. Um, and I would say that the interest that people started to have in spirituality And I would say COVID itself arose from like a single movement in the body of, I'll say, Tiamat Gaia or Earth in response to, I would say, shifts in the cosmic wind from my perspective. And so you had a lot of people coming into spirituality, often through, I would say, awakenings of disharmony and rupture, which opened up space in people's fields. I would say that this was certainly true of me, where I would say things that cause disharmony in my field started to get louder because you could say the base current of energy that was running through the field of Earth, and I would say pretty much everybody's field, was driving more current through, I would say, leaky networks, and things were getting stirred up. I'd say like perceptions of the world were changing. I would say there was also like an autocatalytic relationship between what was changing spiritually for people and then what was changing physically, such that the changing in people's perceptions that arose mostly from spiritual changes were also causing changes in behavior on a physical level, and that those changes in physical level for a decent period of time led to more rupture, right? Because people's social fabrics were being torn apart, depending on where you were in the world. Um, Authority structures were making rules about things that had to happen and things that could no longer happen. And many of the rules that they were making were also stirring up trauma, which in many cases led to rupture. So I feel like the image I'm kind of getting is of like lava flow, or like ground cracking up and lava seeping through the cracks in the ground. And I do feel like I'm still bringing it back to like spiritual hazard. But yeah, I'll say that in that period of time, existing online spiritual communities saw more traffic, and then new online spiritual communities started to form. I'd say even in parts of the internet which were not, let's say, explicitly spiritual, but also within those online spiritual communities, I would say that behavior that was triggered by this flow of energy through karmic accumulation started to increase. And it created like a froth, um, where a lot of spiritual material was created, often like through interactions between people who are like newly or increased in their spiritual appetite. Um, and then, yeah, I would say like a lot of that spiritual material came through the lens of like karmic accumulation, was therefore distorted. And I'd say like in this period of time, not only has that spiritual material been used to create distortions in people's perception, not only of like each moment, but also distortions of people's perception of like where we're going as a species, or like where we're headed on this planet, on this timeline. But I would also say like a bunch of people became practitioners, started offering services. People who were already practicing and offering services probably saw more of their practice come through the lens of like trauma than previously. Um, and I wouldn't say like any of this was particularly new, but I'd say that like it feels important in this container to describe the context in which like the broom radio arose, and then the context in which like the focus upon safety for the broom radio arose. Yeah, I'm just gonna like pause and see if anybody has any questions about what I'm saying so far. Lexi's saying, I remember I started exploring spiritual stuff mid to late 2018, and then enlightenment eggshells in 2020. Anna says, I read an Eckhart Tolle back in 2018. Book in 2018. Yeah, I would say that I started having spiritual experiences explicitly again around, I want to say like late 2017, early 2018, which led to like things I've talked about in the past, but essentially like led to quitting my job, led to injuring my knee, getting knee surgery, led to acupuncture, reading the I Ching, taking up Bagua, joining New Earth Mystery School, and then COVID happened. I would say, really, I think like people started to hear rumblings about it in the West in the beginning of 2020, if I remember correctly. So it's been a pretty torrid time. But going back to the topic of spiritual hazard and how it relates to the question, I think like the really short answer is that in session with people, like whether you're working with astrologers or working with energy workers, you often get readings, and then people will have their perceptions changed by those readings, whether those readings are about like where they come from and let's say like their astral identity or even like their ancestral identity, or whether those readings are about like what's coming up and how it might affect them based on the conditioning that's accumulated in their vessels. And then, yeah, I would say for people who are like not skilled practitioners in their own right, then they can be anchored by what people say to them in sessions of spiritual practice. Even if like such predictions aren't taking place on an individual level, but as perhaps being delivered through things that people say online about what's happening or what's coming up, I would say that what is said in those transmissions can also change the perceptions of the people who are listening to them. And if you've sort of wondered what I mean when I say that I guarantee that contexts will not be enmeshed and that contexts will be disenmeshed in this container, what I'm referring to is that depending on the nature of the transmission, whether it's private or public, then context enmeshment, I would say, from my perspective, is the base dynamic by which something that somebody says in a session or in a transmission that's public, which could be said to be a collection of contexts or a container of space and time, ends up affecting contexts which come up or contexts which have already happened, which is to say, experiences of space and time in the future and in the past. And I would say that those enmeshments form like a filter which changes the way that we perceive reality, which changes the choices which become available to us, which changes the way that we kind of weight the outcomes of those choices as either preferable or unpreferable, and then ultimately affects which choices we make. And I'm not saying that this is something that like is often, I would say, like a cognitively legible process, but I'd say often it happens unconsciously, right? And when I say unconsciously, I'm kind of using the term colloquially, but I would say that it happens in such a way that when people are asked why they did something, they might say, I don't know, I didn't think about it. And it can also happen in what I was calling a cognitively legible way, such that you could ask somebody why they did something, and they'll say, I thought this, this, and this, and this. And then I would also say that like what they say they thought when they did something is can even correspond to what they actually thought. But what I'm trying to illustrate is a like how context enmeshment might lead to different perceptions of, I'll say, like the possibility planes and choice planes and timelines that are available to us, whether or not you use that language, whether or not you have what is currently often being called in parasocial media a quote inner monologue unquote, as you're perusing, I would say, like this subset of reality dimensionality, which I'm calling possibility planes, choice planes, and timelines. Um, and then that's just like to speak of context enmeshment and how it relates to our ability to perceive reality and then act upon it by making choices. Um, I would say that what leads to context enmeshment is ultimately either creating rupture and or taking advantage of rupture. So I'll say that everybody has like rupture, and to illustrate that, I'll say that like a completely unruptured field, and you know the way that I tend to use this is like a completely crystalline metaphysical body of space and time would be one in which the perception of that body was completely unbroken, which is to say that you could like recall exactly what happened in the space and time of your lifetime from beginning to end to beginning, um, without any loss in precision or accuracy. And then I would say that given that we are, I would say, fruit bearing trees of ancestry in the earth and the sky, then a completely unruptured metaphysical body would mean that the vessel that's alive, like the current fruit bearing tree, would be able to recite all of the perspectives of space and time that make up their earth ancestral body, which is to say, all of the ancestral experiences that they have access to through their DNA, and also all of the ancestral experience that they have access to through the multiple, what sometimes people call past lives or incarnations of all of the souls of their soul complex. Um, and for a number of reasons, I would say that's not possible, right? First of all, I'd say that the spirits of all of those incarnations that make up our earth ancestry and our sky ancestry often have their own karma. And I would say, yes, we often get little bits of that karma in our present life to try and resolve. Um, but our capacity for resolving that karma is pretty limited, right? Like, yes, I would say that there is more space and less, generally, I would say less ongoing stress in the lives of humans today than there was in the past. And that means that there is more, let's say, like nervous space. There is more space for our channels to be more relaxed and open. so that we can harmonize the trauma of our earth ancestors, let's say. But I'd say it's still limited. So that's like one factor. I'd say like another factor is that many of the past lives or other incarnations of our soul complexes in the sky take place in space times or celestial bodies, space times which are associated with celestial bodies which are not legible to our perception within Earth yet. So I would say like they refer to celestial bodies that we haven't even discovered yet, or planets and stars that we know of, but we don't have very much contact with on a psychic or metaphysical level. And then, of course, like everything I said about the karma of our Earth ancestors also applies to them. This is probably one of the longest tangents I've been on, which I'm conscious of, but I'm really curious where it's going. And then I'd say like the last factor I'll like draw awareness to today is just I'd say like the pretty rigid karmic perspective of any given like human vessel, which is to say that our ability to tune into the fields that we connect to through earth and sky ancestry and bring through parts of it is very limited by bodies which have phylogenetically developed to experience reality as like mostly material and then like heavily symbolized and conceptualized. So this is to explain what I mean by we all have rupture. Like these are all, I would say, forms of rupture which have been organized in what is often called veils. And I know the term veils is like pretty common in like, I'd say, present day spiritual parasocial media. But yeah, I tend to call them karmic accumulations or karmic obstructions. And as I've talked about in Why Am I Like This in the past, I would say some of them are much more easy to release than others. Like, I would say we're probably not going to release the veil of having two eyes rather than one or three in our lifetimes for most humans today. But we can release veils which were associated, I would say, with viewing land, or you could say space across time in the gravitational field of Tiamat Gaia as ownable by any one human or any group of humans, which is like the veil of property. And I'd say in this context, what I was saying about context enmeshment in like, I'll say the spiritual industry that I was previously referring to as like distortion or spiritual material or spiritual content coming through the lens of trauma could also be related to veiling. And previously, I talked about how context enmeshment relates to perceptions of reality and then acts upon reality. And then I went on to talk about rupture and how rupture can be characterized. And then I want to bring it back to what I was saying about context enmeshment happening due to either or slash and the creation of rupture and the reworking of rupture. So I'd say like the major way that I would relate this to the container of spiritual hazard is that, wow, this is such a big topic, but I guess I'm really going to go into it. From my perspective, rupture happens when dysregulation occurs beyond a threshold which any given vessel in any moment of space and time has the capacity to harmonize. Which is to say, somebody can touch your field and it could create dysregulation, but perhaps it's below a certain threshold. Or it would usually cause dysregulation to happen above a certain threshold, but one is either like, I would say, intentionally or non intentionally shielded. That shielding, I would say, can occur due to like conceptual weaponry or, I'll say, just to make it simpler, more simple in this context, like preconceptual weaponry, right? So I'll say that in my lineages, or lineages which are very close to the lineages which I feel safe in claiming membership of, there is the idea of like Wei Qi or shielding Qi or encounter Qi, which emanates from Mingmen or the gateway of life, or you could say like the energetic organ, which exists more or less between the physical organs of the kidneys. And this is a form of shielding which I would say is mostly preconceptual. Like I'm describing it conceptually right now. But I would say the cultivation and the projection and the function of that shielding is preconceptual because you kind of feel, in my experience, you feel that it's happening. You feel when things are being shielded out. You feel when your shield is being tested. And that can be represented to the cognitively legible part of your mind in what comes through as like concepts and symbols. But I would say that that happens regardless of whether your mind is aware of it or not. And then, like conceptual shielding includes um, visualizations for me, or, often people say if you have a bad dream or you feel like a bad spirit is around, then you can invoke the protection of like Jesus Christ or something like that. And I would call that like a conceptual shield, or it's like the concepts which you're invoking and giving awareness to those concepts gives you a sense of safety, which makes you more shielded against things which would otherwise be dysregulating and could cause disharmony in one's nervous system beyond a certain threshold and therefore cause rupture. And then I would say, yeah, like what happens when rupture occurs is that our field starts to fragment, right? So it's not necessarily that like the self concept or the cognitively legible part of our mind is separated from itself internally or other parts of our mind. I would say that like separation can occur anywhere in our field when rupture occurs. But basically, like the analogy I'll use, which hopefully most of y'all are familiar with, because it could happen to you one day and it would be really good if you could get yourself out of it, is that, you know, most houses in like modern countries have like fuse boxes so that if any one of your appliances draws too much current, there is a fuse which will blow because it detects that too much current is flowing through the network, and that is associated with like electrocution. Um, so fuse boxes are like safety mechanisms, and I would say that when somebody is dysregulated beyond a certain threshold, um, it's like too much current flowing through a network, and you could say that our nervous systems have fuse boxes built into them, which break the network so those parts of our field don't end up taking down the whole network, right? So in order to like avoid, let's say, like a complete I'll say shielding quote nervous breakdown unquote, we basically fragment, and then those parts of ourselves become separate from the other parts of ourselves. And I would say probably separate from the parts of ourselves which are necessary to continue functioning in, yeah, I'll say like social and material realities. Um, so when I talk about, say, rupture happening or being reworked in the context of like spiritual practice or spiritual hazard, I'll say that for me, a dysregulating influence occurs whenever any one body's perspective in space and time is misaligned with the perspective of another body in space and time. And I'm sort of saying that in like a pretty provocative way, because I would say that like when we have ruptured selves, the different contiguous parts of ourself constitute bodies with different perspectives, right? So in, let's say, like internal family systems or soul retrieval practices or somatic experiencing practices will often talk about parts. And I would say that they relate to like more or less contiguous, I'll say, geometries of space and time, which have developed enough complexity to appear as selves. And like whether these are like more demonic or whether they're like more related to like, let's say, undistorted arrangements of space and time or selfhood is sort of like a case by case thing. Um, so in this context, I'll say that there is space for rupture to occur internally, right? And I think probably most people have had the experience of like what some people call like the inner critic. And I would say in that context, there is an arrangement of self which is berating the rest of the self or parts of the rest of the self in a way that perspectives are being shared symbolically and or conceptually, which can cause misalignment of perspective to become material between those different parts of self. And that can cause dysregulation, which leads to like more fragmentation within the self. But to bring it back to the context of like spiritual hazard again, I'll say that we can be in these containers, let's say one-on-one sessions or in public containers where people share perspectives which are misaligned with our perspective in words. You could say like if it happens in person, then that perspective can be shared in ways which are pre-verbal, as in like you might end up with somebody who shows you via body language something that you interpret as being, disliked. And maybe, or hopefully, there are like massive parts of yourself which like yourself. And so that perspective would be misaligned. And that misalignment could cause dysregulation, which could cause rupture. Um, and of course, this can happen in text and it can happen in voice. And hopefully, this is giving y'all some context about the guarantee that I make at the beginning of these containers. But also, hopefully, it's giving y'all some, I'll say, and terms about the kind of spiritual hazard which can happen online. And I would say that when that rupture occurs, it creates like leakages of awareness, or you could say like disconnected context. And that context can be enmeshed. And I'll say that like for me, enmeshment is different from like say connection, which relates to what I was saying before about like a crystalline body of space and time, and the ability to recall with precision and accuracy from moment to moment in any direction, or even non-linearly, what has happened in the perception of a body of space and time. I would call that, in this context, connection. And then I would say enmeshment, for me, relates to connections between spaces and times in geometries which distort the accurate recall or remembering of those moments of space and time. And so hopefully y'all can see, like, in a really simple example, how somebody telling you something about yourself which is inaccurate could cause rupture. It could cause dysregulation, which doesn't necessarily look like getting triggered the way that we tend to associate getting triggered with, which is usually like anger or like sadness. And then it could cause one's self-perception to become inaccurate. And then how that could lead to making choices which enact timelines which are distorted. I'm just gonna like hold space and see if there's anything that anybody wants to say. Before I continue talking about how this relates to the importance of verifying and making predictions. This is like a very big topic. Hoda says, I'm giggling because firstly, relatable, two, it happens for me like often. Do you want to say more about what happens often, Hoda? I guess the one way I didn't talk about how perspectives can misalign. I talked about body language, I talked about like verbal materialization of perspective, which causes misalignment. I think like the thing which maybe I'll talk about with regard to some of the other containers um, relates to like immaterial perspective misalignment. So ways in which perspectives can misalign, but it's not necessarily materialized, as in no one says anything. Other says, I've got to go in my laptop. Okay, I'll hold space if you want to say more about what you said. Um, so like to bring it back to like predictions and spiritual hazard. I feel like the reason that I didn't talk about immaterial perspective alignment is because I wanted to talk about what predictions are to me, and particularly what kinds of predictions can help to determine, by some measure, the extent to which somebody may be practicing in a spiritually hazardous way. Um, so first of all, I'll say like my definition of prediction is fairly etymologically essential. So diction comes from the word to like uh, to say, right? To say something. And then the word pre means like, okay, like prediction means like something I said before. And I think like the unrepresented symbolic material there is like, I said something was going to happen before it happened. And I feel like what I'm going to say next kind of draws a little bit of awareness from the container, which I was describing as relating to myth making and science, I believe. Is kind of how it's presenting to me now. But In most of the context I was talking about with regard to the spiritual hazard container, I would say relate to outcomes which arise from somebody saying something to somebody in a way that perspectives become, I'll say, enmeshed, or context becomes enmeshed in a materialized way. Um, and I think how it relates to science in this context is that I'll say that like science can be described in many ways, but the way I'll describe it now um, relates to describing the relationship between certain observable events and then observable events that happen after the first set of observable events in a perspective of linear time. And I would say that people tend to say that something is scientifically proven in current time when the relationship that is being described between the first set of observable events and the second set of observable events happens regardless of whether people who are influential in the causal chain between the first set of observable events um, knew about the first set of observable events in enacting the second set of observable events, which is to say that, like, a relationship between two sets of observable events is said to be scientifically proven if it happens whether or not people who are involved in observing those events knew that the first set of observable events occurred. Um, and in the containers that I was describing, whether they're private or public, with regard to spiritual hazard, I would say that the people who are the people who are involved in observing the relationships between the events that were predicted, let's say, by a spiritual practitioner, um, and the event where the spiritual practitioner predicted and communicated those predictions, they know, right? So if somebody tells you something's going to happen in your life and then you see that thing happen, you were there when they told you, and you were there when you observed the thing happen. So I would say that from the perspective of science in current time, it's not scientifically proven that the predictive capacities of the person who told you the thing was going to happen are true or real, because they had to tell you in order for you to observe that those things happened. And I would say that, like, the chain by which those events could happen and how it relates to rupture and context enmeshment and perception distortion and choice distortion, and therefore timeline distortion, sort of invalidates the prospects of that spiritual practitioner having what could be called like clear precognition or clear predictive capacities. Um, does that make sense? I guess like another way of saying it is that, like, in telling you that something is going to happen, that person could anchor you towards making those things happen through materializing perspectives that cause rupture, and then context enmeshment. And I feel like part of the reason this topic feels so big to me is that I think it's very possible, and this is like I would say space which I haven't like articulated, but space that I would say exists in the previous articulation of what I said about context enmeshment and rupture, is that it's very possible from my perspective for somebody to tell you something that's going to happen in the future without causing rupture or context enmeshment. First of all, it could just be that they're telling you stuff that you already perceive to be true, whether you've justified it to yourself or articulated it to yourself symbolically or conceptually or not, right? So often if somebody says something to us, you might hear say somebody, especially like in like current times spiritual circles, say this align. Um, which is to say that like their body is like cool, like my body with all of its karmic accumulation, which could be causing me to see reality inaccurately, is not at all disharmonized by you telling me what your perspective is. um, and therefore no dysregulation occurs, therefore no rupture occurs, therefore no new context enmeshment. um, but I would also say that it's possible that somebody can share a perspective with another person, which doesn't cause dysregulation or rupture, by adequately qualifying it, even if that perspective is misaligned. And I won't say that like lexically qualifying it by saying things like, in my opinion, or from my perspective, or I feel like, or it sounds like. I won't say that using those lexical shields is necessarily enough to cause dysregulation not to occur, but I would say that when we don't use those shields, people who are very like astrally open on some level, or symbolically open, you could say they have like very open receiving portals on their throat chakra, are often more likely to believe people who don't qualify their perspectives. Or you could say that like not qualifying those perspectives, from my perspective, basically causes rupture very, very easily, and then causes context enmeshment. And then I would say, like, on the other end of that, like, if you share a perspective which is sufficiently misaligned with another person's perspective, even using those lexical shields won't really help that much. Like, if you're like, well, I just feel like blah, 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 something very triggering. You could say you're using those lexical shields, but what you're saying, or you could say even like your body language or your tone, or you could say even like immaterial artifacts of what you're saying, might very well cause the person to become dysregulated and for context to become enmeshed. Um, just reading the chat. Um, and I would say that like some of the things I'm talking about fit under, I'll call it like an umbrella of skilled practice, right? So like whether you're working with a practitioner who just sees things which don't misalign with your body, whether you've articulated themselves to your, articulated them to yourself or not, I would say like that's a form of being a skilled practitioner. I would also say that even if those perspectives align with somebody's body, then using lexical shields in appropriate context, because I think it's also worth saying that using these lexical shields can make it harder for people to understand other people. But I would say the combination of aligned perspectives being shared in a way which is lexically shielded usually constitutes skill practice to me. And then I would say it's almost kind of like a C plus, like B minus, if you're sharing misaligned perspectives, but you use lexical shields, then that's like, yeah, like a B minus, C plus level of skill. Um, but hopefully y'all can see why it makes sense to develop all these different forms of skill, right? Because I would say that it's pretty much impossible in any given context to know for sure that our perspectives are going to be aligned, right? So, yes, I would say like using one's body to determine how much distortion might be in one's perspective can be useful. I mean, I would say it almost always is useful to determine like how clear one's perspective is and the extent to which it's likely to align with another person's perspective. But I'd also say that in contexts where there is like uncertainty, which is basically every context, because I don't feel like we can ever, like I said before, like we're always going to carry rupture, which is to say that our perspectives are always going to be distorted to some extent. Then I would say using lexical shields in appropriate circumstances can lower the chance of rupture and context enmeshment and therefore reality distortion. But to bring it back to prediction and science, and I guess like manifestation versus prediction, I'll say that how it pertains to the question around like the importance of prediction and verifying predictions is that like there are many ways in which I believe spiritual practitioners can make predictions without violating, I'll say, the fields of actors who end up influencing whether the outcomes of those predictions are true. So one way is like, say, in a private session, you might end up, as a practitioner, I'll say, like, I often end up feeling like things are going to happen for somebody, but I don't tell them. So I'll just write it down somewhere. And I'll say there is a predictions channel in the Broom where people are also logging predictions. I don't think anyone's like logged any predictions and named who those predictions relate to when it pertains to like individuals they're doing work with. But I'd say that like another way that one can make predictions without violating that chain from the perspective of what I would call like current time science is to make predictions on events of a vast nature, let's say like sporting events, which is to say that like I can write down a prediction about what's going to happen in a soccer game between Leeds and, let's say, Leicester. But it's very unlikely that anybody's going to read that who is like heavily influential in the result of that game. And therefore, if that prediction is correct, then it's very unlikely for someone to say like, oh, that only became true because Nobu said that something was going to happen and then somebody read it and then they were involved in that game to the extent that they could make it come true. How they're saying, I get visions for folk all the time. I haven't figured out how to facilitate telling folk outside of holding space for people to book sessions with me. I feel confident at predicting weather outcomes and relational outcomes. Yeah, I think like I would say that my success with predicting relational outcomes is much higher than my success with predicting sporting outcomes. Because I would say that the weather of sporting outcomes is very heavy, right? So we're talking about like sporting events, which a lot of people care about. And I would say that the weather is influenced by the level of attachment that people have to the outcomes of those sporting events. And I would say that the level of attachment that, let's say, Leeds and Leicester fans have to the outcome of a Leeds and Leicester game tends to be like very high. And then like the athletes themselves tend to be very attached to the outcomes of those games. And then I would say also because a lot of athletes are like very, very embodied, their influence metaphysically and physically is very high. So making correct predictions when it comes to those events is very difficult. And I would say that like my having been called to do that fairly often has felt like a very rigorous refining process. But yes, I would say relational outcomes tend to be easier to predict for me because like, you don't have like millions of people caring about a given relationship outcome. Um, um, and then like when it comes to like non-metaphysical weather, and you're talking about like rain and like, um, yeah, I'm curious if you want to say anything more about that. And it sounds like when you said haven't figured out how to facilitate telling folk outside of holding space for people to book sessions, you're talking about like wanting to tell them like what your predictions would be.
Yeah, and like sometimes working with a nudge from like a vaster sense of guidance to like inform them about the predictions that I've like made, and mostly like it's people that I'm like in relationship with, right? So it's not like just like random
Mm.
strangers. Um, Sometimes it is random strangers, and then the courting gets really awkward from there, I'd say. But anyways, regarding I think weather, what you said was really interesting to me, um, because I've always like just I guess it's not superficial actually. It's like deeply relational. Like where I live in the South, like in New Orleans, is like the river delta of the United States, and so
Mm.
like I guess predicting weather the way that it occurs for me. Most of the times, my predictions will filter through dreams,
Mm.
and I'll have like a dream of a storm before the storm happens.
Mm.
Um, I've also heard of other people getting like other somatic cues about like certain weather, and weather's funny because it's like such a banal, I think, like small talk kind of conversation, but the weather kind of determines a lot. I feel. Um,
100%.
yeah, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see like why it has that like small talk thing because I think people often talk about the weather because they're dysregulated, right?
It's so ironic.
But yeah, it's super. like, but I feel like yeah, it has that. Yeah, because yeah, mostly I'd say like when people talk about things when they're dysregulated, it just tends to be noise, and then yeah, when people talk about weather, it ends up being something that people look down upon. But yeah, I think you're right also that like weather literally like like there's a farmer's almanac which is said to be one of the most accurate sort of like medium to long term weather predictive, I'll say like oracles right now.
Mm.
Because it has such an influence on like the health of our populations and like geopolitics, right? Like there are a bunch of people who say that the war in Ukraine is happening because there's so much fertile soil in that part of the world right now, and that's not what they're talking about on either side about their desire to control that territory. But um, you know, I'd say like in like probably a lot of people have sort of forgotten that famine's a thing. I mean, like it's clearly like still a thing in like lots of parts of the world, but I'd say in the parts of the world that are like loudest on media, probably not. Um, so yeah, I'd say like it's definitely super important. And then like some of the lineages, I would say like I feel related to contain like what were called like storm magicians. Um, so yeah, I think like predicting weather very important, right? Because often like in order to take advantage of that weather or also in order to avoid getting rocked by that weather, it makes sense to have like some time to prepare for it. And I feel like that's like really pertinent when it comes to like, yeah, like you're saying like the river delta that you commune with. um, and then I would say also that manifesting weather was also a part of the practice of those peoples. Um, and you're saying I'm trying to get it to fully translate to cosmic weather.
Yes, I'm happy you mentioned that development because I was like, does the octave like after a certain amount of hours, like who do I talk to about this to like kind of get it working
hmm.
with cosmic weather? So I'm glad you're going there.
I'm not sure how I'm going there because I'm also looking
Yeah,
at the time. Like this is one of the longest episodes of Why Am I Like This, but I'm feeling called to keep talking. Maybe
Shay. I
we'll
was
like
like, as
chop
long
it
as
up into two parts or something. I don't
maybe.
fucking know. Um, but it is a really big topic, and we haven't even really talked that much about science yet. Um, woo. I guess like the first thing that comes up, like in talking about predicting, let's just say like regular physical weather, um, is that yeah, obviously like there are like very mundane ways to do that. I was going to talk about how like astrology, I would say in many ways was often about predicting weather and making associations between different times of year and things that happen at that time of year, and then things which happened which people had to prepare for, right? Like, how do you prepare for rain? Like, how do you make sure that what you're trying to plant can take the most advantage of the moisture which is coming? How do you know when to like harvest? Um, and I would say like most of those things ultimately relate to taking materialized cues, like um, what's the temperature like, how high is the sun in the sky, what kinds of flowers are appearing, which animals are crawling out of places and seeing their own shadow.com. Um, and yeah, in some ways, I would say like predicting weather in that way doesn't feel like necessarily like spiritual, although, of course, all of the symbols and the concepts that we talk about and how they relate to the material are, I would say, geometries of spiritual energy, which is to say, like arrangements of perspective. And then I would say also, of course, the material realm is a spiritual realm and relates to like very specific and very dense geometries of perspective, which we call things like rocks, and plants and animals and planets and stars. But yeah, when I kind of feel into like what you're talking about around like having dreams, like I'm gonna guess that like you could make an argument that on some like subconscious level, like you're taking in the kinds of cues which ended up being materialized and then becoming part of like the logos of these mundane weather prediction paradigms, right? Like maybe you are sort of on some level seeing that a groundhog came out of where it was living and then saw its own shadow, and then you're seeing like these plants appear and then blah 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 blah, and then like your brain or your body as a supercomputer is sort of generating a dream which relates to a storm happening, and then that storm happens. But I'd say like that feels like, for me it feels like more of a stretch than believing that yes, your body is a supercomputer, and it's yes, perhaps computing upon material experiences that you had in the world in order to generate this prediction. But it feels more likely that in order to generate a prediction of that clarity, you would have to be tuning into things that you had not experienced materially. Um, and kind of as I kind of tune into it and like something have talked about before about navigating time within like the envelope of space and time that we call this timeline within the gravitational body of Earth. I say that like, and I've said it in Why Am I Like This too, and I've said it in like different podcasts before. It's like I'm kind of like refining my channel so that I can listen to the core of the Earth, and then through the core of the Earth I can listen to like the perspective from outside of Earth within our solar system. And then I'd say like from the perspective of our solar system, and I would say its clarified channel, I can refer to the perspective of our galaxy and so on and so forth, like into like vaster envelopes of space and time that include the envelope of space and time that's Earth. And then I would say that like every time we jump outside of a space-time envelope, then we are looking at the time inside that space-time envelope, quote, outside of time, unquote. And I would say like outside of time, we can see all of the possibility planes and choice planes and timelines on some level of ourself. And then I would say like a lot of like the skill of spiritual practice from my perspective relates to connecting the timeline that one's vessel is on. And I'm kind of talking from a vaster self perspective right now. But connecting the timeline that my vessel's on as it's communing with me, let's say like having this dream about the storm, and then tracing that timeline to see what's happening on that timeline so that the vaster self can relate what's going to happen on that timeline backwards to when the vaster self is communing with, I would say, like the denser self or the self that's dreaming in the context that you described. And of course, like I don't think that most people would be like, oh, like Hoda actually caused that storm by having the dream about that storm, because like Hoda's body is relatively small compared to the amount of wind which has to be amassed from like all these different directions. It would take a lot for Hoda to like fly around and like somehow like put all this wind in a bag and then like deliver it in these certain ways that brings a lot of moisture into a certain area so that it creates a storm. But I would say that I'm kind of sketching out some of the dynamics of what I would call like halal prediction. And which is to say that like it's prediction which doesn't rely upon you having materially communicated with beings that are instrumental in making the events that you predicted occur. I'm also like, I sketched out like a absurd scenario where you were flying around and like directing wind of adequate moisture into the river delta to create a storm. But there's also an equally absurd scenario where like you're talking to like 5 billion homies and they're all helping you create this storm in a material sense. But I feel like the dynamic I was talking about relates more to understanding what's happening in one's body when one considers one's body to contain a planet. So like, something I often say to be like a little bit lighthearted or something is, and I think like other people said this, I might have like heard this from like Mariam or something, but it's just like, how do you know when you need to pee? And then like if you consider that like a vaster self that one connects to can tell that it's about to pee, and that your body is like one cell on, let's say like, I'll say like a mental pathway between like the part of the body that pees and then like the recognition that someone's about to pee, then you could say that you might end up hearing a prediction of that happening. And then, like, in this context, I don't know, this is not like necessarily part of the question, but it feels like I'm going to talk about it anyway. I'll say that, like, in this context, manifestation, I'd say, like, within this framework, manifestation would only occur, I'd say, on two levels, right? So, like, I'd say on three levels. I'd say, like, on one level, I think it's possible for people to believe they've manifested things when they've merely predicted them. Which is to say that they might become part of, like, this communicational chain between, like, a denser self and a vaster self, and then see something happen and then feel like they made it happen because the thing that happened aligns with, like, what they want to happen. And I would say that's kind of like, I'm not going to say whether it's, like, real or fake, actually. I'll just say that's, like, one form of manifestation that I want to kind of, like, in this context, hold out as separate from the other contexts. Um, I'd say, like, another form of manifestation, like the most obvious form of manifestation, is that, like, one might feel called to do something and then see that the thing that one did was within the material causal chain of something that they predicted. So, for instance, like, a really mundane example would be, like, I feel like I'm going to, well, I'll say, like, I'll talk about synchronicity, which I experienced recently, which is that, like, I discovered some music which is from, like, an artist who is from Hokkaido. And then I felt like I was gonna go get some food, and I felt like it was gonna be Japanese. And then I ended up at a restaurant and found out that it was specific to Hokkaido. And you could say that, like, me getting on the bus, me feeling like I was gonna get Japanese food, all relates to, like, materially acting in the causal chain that makes, like, something that feels like metaphysically orchestrated happen. Um, Actually, we're also talking about how synchronicity relates to prediction and manifestation. Just kind of meditating on how to, like, say something in a way which doesn't cause context enmeshment. I guess I'm also meditating on, like, whether I can meaningfully broach the topic of, like, manifesting without prediction, and the importance in some cases of manifesting without prediction, but I feel like it's a bridge too far for this container. Anyway, I'll say that, like, the last category of manifestation which I want to name within this framework is, like, when one feels called to do something which doesn't feel as if it's materially related to the causal chain of that thing happening. Um, and I think this, like, relates back to what I was saying about, like, storm magicians, which are, like, sort of adjacent to my lineages, and also probably relates to experiences like y'all have had and maybe other people who are listening have had, where I'll say, like, often I feel called to go somewhere and dance, and then I'll point to the sky and then lightning will strike. And you could say that that's manifestation in a sense, like, I was doing something. I would say that doesn't belong to the previous category of manifestation because, like, people don't believe that there is, like, a material causal chain between me pointing at the sky or dancing and then lightning striking. Um, I would say that the way it differs from like mere prediction is that I feel like some of the things I was called to do, if I did not do them, then that thing wouldn't have happened. And I've talked a little bit about how light language works from my understanding in other containers for why am I like this. So I won't go too far into it now, but I'll say that the interactions which occur in order for that manifestation to occur happen both in realms of perception that cannot be measured from our realm of perception, and realms of perception which are not currently measurable with the tools that we have within our realm of perception. Ooh, my left hip just cracked. What is saying? Causal chains, not chains, rope, ripples. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I feel like a chain almost implies that it's like one event links to one event links to one event, whereas I feel like a ripple is actually like more accurate because one event tends to lead to more than one event. And you know, there are chains which occur like that as well, like where you have one chain which branches out into multiple chains. But they're not common. I wouldn't say that most people tend to think of those as chains. I would say people tend to think of them as like nets, maybe, which I've also talked about pretty recently and why am I like this. But I would say like the reason I call them causal chains is they relate to science, because I would say that science is mostly materialistic in current time. And I would also say that like in science it's necessary to discretely name material events in current time. And so I would say that act of discretization causes ripples to become symbolized as chains, perhaps. Um, hmm. I'm just going to tune back into the container of the question because I feel like we've gone pretty vast and covered a lot of ground. But what is the importance of predictions, making predictions and verifying predictions in my experience? What's the question? Well, I feel like I've mostly described a bunch of different dynamics which relate to why or how predictions might be perceived. And I would say how predictions can cause reality distortion. Um, and I would say also ways in which we can make predictions without causing reality distortion. I've talked a little bit about the importance of predictions when it comes to refining one's perspective, possibly in order to make predictions more accurately for other people or for oneself. Um, but I'll say, to speak really lightly on that topic very quickly, I'll say that when one makes predictions and gets them wrong, I would say it's been part of my practice to meditate on the outcome which actually occurred and the outcomes which I thought were occurring, so I can understand the discrepancy between those timelines and how they felt in my body, so I can understand what caused my body on the timeline I'm on to make an inaccurate prediction. Because often I'll say that some distortion in the space and time of my body caused me to believe that events were going to pile up in one direction when in fact they piled up in a different direction. And if I meditate on those two different outcomes, I can understand, or I can locate the parts of my body which I'll say chose the wrong timeline when making my prediction. And then I'll also like connect back to what I was saying about like some predictions or some events being subject to stronger forces than others. And I'll say that when there's a lot of like attachment related to whether an outcome happens or not, it's much harder to read. Just to say that like the pool of that outcome ends up being disturbed by a lot of different people's perspectives and also actions. And then also those actions tend to relate to other people's perspectives. So I would say that like when I'm predicting sporting results, I'm also called to put into effect chains of manifestation and also ripples of manifestation, which belong to the category of having to do things which do not have a material causal relationship, which most people can perceive between like the events I'm predicting and the events that happen. And I would say like this is refining in a way that's separate to how I was talking about refining my ability to make predictions in the same way that like lifting weights makes the body stronger. Because I would say that the same protocols that I'm using to enact certain events are used by some of the people who are much closer to like whether those events happen or not, right? So like you could say more concretely, like some of the players in the games that I'm making predictions about are also like very spiritually connected. So they're operating in those channels in which I'm operating. And then, of course, they also have the privilege of often being in the games that I'm making predictions about and trying to make manifestations within. So competing against that spiritual and physical manifestation on a purely spiritual level is something that I feel like I'm often preparing my body for in the making of predictions. And then, yeah, I'd say in the verifying of predictions, I'm often finding inefficiencies in my body which related to me choosing the wrong timeline and also not being able to manifest in the, I would say, like possibility and choice planes, which might have made the result that I predicted true. I'm looking back at the container of the question again. I mean, I feel like I've spoken adequately about the importance of verifying predictions when it comes to like reducing spiritual risk. And I feel like I also talked about other things that we can do to reduce spiritual hazard as practitioners. And I feel like I also gave y'all a shit ton of material to question whether the guarantees that I make at the beginning of why am I like this are well kept by me, which is, you know, an interesting tactic for my vaster self, but I would say it more or less kind of relates to something that Abraham Lincoln said about like surrounding yourself with people who disagree with you. And I would say it extends upon that by giving people the material that they could use to disagree with you in order to keep yourself very, very sharp and to keep yourself honest and accountable, which I think also relates to the importance of verifying predictions. And I would say posting predictions in public places in ways or in contexts where the things that we say in those predictions cannot be connected to the material chain of events which causes those outcomes to eventuate. And I feel like it's always going to be impossible to prove that somebody who made a prediction didn't talk to somebody who was instrumental in making the prediction come true. Because we can only, like, until we live in a world where everybody is completely surveyed or surveillance, I'm not sure what the right term to use is there, it's going to be impossible to prove, let's say, that like somebody who made a prediction or made a bet didn't like bribe a player to do a certain thing in order to make that prediction come true, which is, I'd say, like the subject of a lot of like I'd say like justice and like rule enforcement when it comes to professional sports. But I feel like if we are interested not only in like proving that some of the things that we believe we and other people are capable of on spiritual or metaphysical levels is real to a lot of people, then I feel like a lot of the dynamics I've laid out in this container, both in terms and in terma, are important to respect when it comes to coming up with narratives using the language of science, which I would say is in some ways like, like people say this is like the prevailing religion of our times. And I would say like even if people aren't necessarily like scientifically very literate, the language of science and what people call the scientific method often ends up in the creation of narratives that people who are not scientifically literate end up believing and parroting, and end up, I would say becoming like the zeitgeist or the spirit of the time. And I would say often because of the lack of scientific literacy, a lot of the narratives which are made using the scientific method or using the scientific method poorly end up becoming the mainstream narrative. I'm just meditating to see if there's anything else to say about narrative making in science. And also holding space to see if y'all have said anything which I want to talk on. There's this whole container about, I'm going to say, categories of spiritual phenomena which are difficult to verify within the current time model of science. And it's a really big container, but I'm just going to like put it in the container of this episode so that the term are available. And then I'll say that repeatability is very difficult. I would say like correctly isolating the right variables within modes of spiritual practice is very difficult. I'll say that often the connection between like a working of spiritual energy and then a material outcome occurring takes a bunch of time, and it's difficult to isolate the persons who are involved in the verifying that the material outcome eventuates, such that the material outcome eventuating cannot be attributed to a different cause other than the spiritual working. And then I would also say that for most, I'll say, halal spiritual workings, it's going to require material events to happen which are going to be much easier to be for people to believe to be causal to that material event or material outcome occurring than the spiritual working itself. So like recently I posted on Twitter and like different social media platforms about how in my modality of practice, I'm mostly removing karmic obstructions so that people can do things that they otherwise wouldn't have done, and that can lead to material outcomes occurring. I'm not going to talk about something I did recently which played out over the course of 2.5 months, but I would say that if one is affecting a material outcome in a different way, like I would say by enmeshing karma instead of disenmeshing karma, then it's likely to be not halal. And I would say that if one is holding space for material outcomes to happen by removing karmic obstructions, then it's always going to require material events that can happen and more material causes to for that material outcome to occur. And therefore there's always going to be, like, I'll say, like a lot of uncertainty around whether the spiritual energy working was, I'll say, quote, material, unquote, or not, which is to say, like, whether that would have happened if the spiritual work hadn't happened. But I would say that pretty much any other form of working is going to require making karmic obstructions to cause people to do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And while they may be more scientifically verifiable within empirical or like materialistic modes of interpersonal verification, I would say that that doesn't feel aligned for me. And then I would also say that observing people in isolation is in itself a form of karmic obstruction, and that doesn't feel aligned for me, let alone doing it in sample sizes which are large enough so that you could say, like, probability or amplitude of error is like considered statistically insignificant, or you could say that like the results that come out of whatever study one is doing are statistically significant. There's so much to say about science and spiritual science, but I feel like saying anything other than that would probably be unnecessary and inappropriate, for this container at least. But yeah, my sense is that, like, entertaining this question in this container allowed for transmitting a bunch of terms and terma relating, I would say, to making narratives about the metaphysical affordances of many spiritual modalities, and doing so in a way that makes them believable. And then also, I would say, terms and terma relating to protecting ourselves from and identifying spiritual malpractice, and then terms and terma relating to using predictions and manifesting predicted outcomes in ways that can be spiritually refining and spiritually expansive. So I guess I'll pause and just ask, like, if there's anything like I didn't cover for y'all that you would like me to cover before I close the container, which is already, say, like 80% longer than most Why Am I Like This containers. Hodo says I'm gonna watch Spirit Sides tonight. I think, like, something that you said, Hodo, which I kind of want to speak on, which is like really spicy, I think, is like when you were talking about like making space or setting containers to let people know about visions you had about them. And it's like, like most of what I was talking about is how talking to people can sort of invalidate, you could say claims of either like manifesting those outcomes metaphysically or predicting those outcomes metaphysically, because like most people would say like, oh, it's because you told them it came true. But I feel like it's spicy because like I think it's super aligned to do that, and I also think it's possible to do it in ways which don't cause rupture and context enmeshment. But I would say that, yeah, to make it like super concrete, if you can like arrange a session with somebody to tell them in like a non-rupturous way what's going to happen, then yes, telling them can help them to actually enact that outcome without enmeshing context, without causing them to become attached to it, without causing them to only see the options that you've laid out to them, and turn away from options which would be competing for their awareness, let's say, and which would lead to different material outcomes arising. And I'll say like it's kind of spicy because I feel like in order to like talk about that, we kind of have to explain that like, yeah, I mean, I would say that like every day is a spiritual war, right? Like we've talked about spiritual war in the context of the internet and sort of like the war of ideas or the marketplace for ideas. But I would say that there are thought forms which are always trying to steer us off of our most aligned paths. And sometimes I would say like intervening in a way which is like going to invalidate one's ability to make scientific claims about, one's metaphysical skill is more aligned because it's just that important that the people that we're working with actually do the thing which is most cosmic, instead of falling prey to the thought forms which get them to do things which are like chaotic. Holly says, yes, I see it as a sense of support when it's well crystalline. So it's like, I think it's really spicy because it also opens up space for knowing that doing things in a scientifically clean way is not always the cosmic way. And what I said about like conducting scientific trials and how that can be like in some ways repressive or karmically obstructive is also true. But sometimes I'd say it's more important to do things in a way which feels like it's scientifically unclean because it's more likely to help people enact cosmic timelines. Hoda says, absolutely. I feel like it's about liberation, offering people their psychic real estate back or the chance to fight for it back. Shielding. And then I'd say like an added spice level there is that not only are like we competing with thought forms which can cause rupture and context enmeshment by themselves, but I would say that we're also competing with other humans who tend to say things which cause rupture and context enmeshment, right? So like even like right now within the Broom Radio, I'm recording an episode of Why Am I Like This, but it's probably going to appear on Spotify and YouTube and maybe one day Instagram alongside the content of people like Bentinho Massara, right? And I would say that they tend to say things in ways which are not only not lexically shielded, but I would say they're also lexically primed to cause rupture. And I'll like invoke the example of somebody called Brian Johnson, who's launched a movement called Don't Die, which, I'm saying I'm shielding this metaphysically, but I'd say most of the time if someone tells you don't die, it's probably going to pull on your heart chords. It's probably going to key into trauma around dying. It's not lexically shielded. It's illustrated as an imperative/command. So I would say like as a lexical concoction, it has all of these elements which are designed to increase rupture and cause context enmeshment. And I would say that most people refer to this in the industry as, quote, good marketing, unquote. But I would say from a metaphysical perspective, it feels really chaotic and disintegrative to me. But going back to what I was saying about like the extra spice level involved in, like, I would say containers where we feel called to tell people what we think is available to happen to them, or like even in some circumstances, I would say really spicy, to tell people what's going to happen. I'll say is that like sometimes it may be necessary to enmesh contexts so that people can get safely to their cosmic destinations, because otherwise they're going to be subject to thought forms which come through other people, or thought forms which are already in their field, or even thought forms which are transmitted to them from their vaster selves, which cause them to do things which are disintegrative, or cause them to avoid or miss their most cosmic destinations. And that's just like how war works, right? Sometimes, like, doing something which is not completely pure ends up reducing harm. And I won't say that, like, I've often felt called to do this, and I won't say that I've felt called to do it in a why am I like this container. But I'll say that, like, sometimes I felt called to do this, and I'm like asking my vaster self, like, wait, like, doesn't this is kind of like not the thing that we like to do, right? Like, this is the thing that we say is like dangerous. And then I'll ask my body like 18 million times, and my body will tell me that, like, if I don't do this, then much worse things will occur. And I would say, like, the same thing applies to working with people, and then those people getting attached to us. Like, I'd say, like, from a classic, or, like, from a approved, like, psychotherapeutical, psychological, ethical perspective, one is supposed to, like, not allow attachment to occur, and to, like, end the relationship when attachment is occurring. But I would say, like, there have been contexts where I'm working with people where I can tell that attachment's happening. I can tell it's hurting my body, and I can tell it's like taking energy away from me. And I can also tell that from like certain perspectives it looks unethical. But my sense has been that if that attachment doesn't occur, then worse attachment will occur to less scrupulous practitioners. And basically, like, that's impossible to verify materially, because I would say that in order to verify that that's true, one has to be able to see different timelines, which I would say almost by definition means looking at things which have not materialized. Um, and I would say that puts it in the realm of faith for me. There's also like interpersonal verification, in the sense that you can ask other practitioners that you trust, and even practitioners that you don't trust, to see if like your read is correct. But then you're just kind of networking your faith with their faith. And I would say there are probably ways of doing that which come from like fear, which is to say that you might second guess your faith or your perspective, and ask for somebody else's perspective from a place of fear. But I would also say that I've been called to ask for other people's perspective from a place of what feels like centeredness. So yeah, I guess like I've just kind of gone and like laid out a bunch of different parameters of, um, like what some people might call like dark art. I think like what I was talking about is basically the norm in terms of how people interact with each other, whether they're spiritual practitioners or not, which is to say that it's normal in my experience for people to project their perspective onto other people's perspectives. When those perspectives misalign, I would say it's overwhelmingly normal not to lexically shield what one's saying, let alone energetically shield it. And I would say that it's maybe, yeah, like 90% normal amongst populations which don't include spiritual practitioners, and then probably like about 87% normal in populations which are limited to spiritual practitioners, which is to say, from my perspective, most spiritual practitioners are both lexically and energetically very, very, very sloppy. But that's part of why I feel like called to work on this thing that we call the stick. So um, I'm gonna say thank you for tuning in. I'm not sure exactly how I'm gonna like work with this episode, but I pray that what was offered is aligned, and I pray that the guarantee that I made about not enmeshing contexts and only dish enmeshing contexts has been well kept. But as always, if you have any offerings of refinement for me, then and they come in good faith based on my judgment of good faith, then I'd love to hold space for them. You can find information about supporting this offering and also joining these containers live and joining the Broom Discord server in the description of this episode if it makes it to YouTube and Spotify. But thank you again for joining. Thank you, Lexi, for the offering of this question. Thank you for your help in interpersonally verifying whether I keep my guarantees or not. And I'll say goodbye.